Imagine walking into Paris at the height of the Belle Époque, the boulevards glowing under gaslight, the Opera Garnier blazing with chandeliers, couture houses on the Rue de la Paix displaying gowns so expensive you'd faint if you saw the bill. Now imagine you're not just there to shop for dresses. You're there to shop for a duke, or a count, or perhaps, if you're really ambitious, a prince who can't afford to fix the roof of his chateau. This was the strange reality for America's richest daughters at the turn of the century. They arrived with trunks stuffed with silk, mothers armed with ledgers, and fortunes fat enough to tempt Europe's hungriest aristocrats. Titles were expensive, but Paris offered them at a discount, provided you didn't mind throwing your happiness in with the purchase. Paris had always sold dreams. It sold them in paintings, in perfumes, in champagne that fizzed like liquid gold. But in the late 19th century, the city discovered a new commodity: American heiresses. These young women, born in New York or Newport, raised in marble palaces built on railroads and steel, were the fresh currency of the Belle Époque. And French aristocrats, centuries old in name but bankrupt in reality, were more than ready to take the exchange. To their families back home, these marriages looked like triumphs. Their daughters elevated into noble houses that traced their bloodlines to crusaders and kings. To Paris society, they looked like spectacles, half admiration, half ridicule. Newspapers drew caricatures of American dollar princesses weighed down in jewels. Satirists muttered that old titles were being pawned like second-hand furniture. But behind the glamour and gossip lay a real truth. Paris had become a marketplace where fortunes and surnames changed hands with the subtlety of a stock exchange. Tonight, as you close your eyes, we're going to wander through that world. We'll step inside the gilded salons where mothers bargained with dowries the size of small country. We'll follow the young heiresses in couture gowns, teetering under pearl chokers, trying to look serene while secretly wondering if their new husband was more interested in their bank account than their smile. And we'll watch, gently and without judgment, as some of those fortunes dissolved into scandals, divorces, and heartbreak, leaving only whispers in the boulevards of Paris. So settle in, and let us begin in the City of Light, where love, fashion, and money danced under the chandeliers, and where America's heiresses bought their titles, one marriage contract at a time. Paris in the Belle Époque was a city determined to be irresistible. And for a generation of American heiresses, it worked. This was not the grey, practical London of dowagers and stiff introductions at court. This was Paris, the glittering capital of art and fashion, where every evening seemed to promise champagne, candlelight, and possibly a prince lurking in the corner. The city itself staged the performance. Haussmann's boulevards, wide and gleaming, framed the fashionable processions of carriages. Gaslights flickered on at dusk, and suddenly Paris became a theatre set, all glowing facades and mirrored windows. The Opera Garnier stood like a marble crown, dripping in statues and gold leaf, while inside, the staircase was designed less for music lovers than for gown wearers. Who cared if you never heard the tenor sing, when you could glide down the stairs in Worth couture, a chandelier scattering light across your diamonds? For Americans, the allure was double. Paris was the world's fashion capital, where Charles Frederick Worth and later his successors turned fabric into art, and where your gown alone could declare you a woman of taste, or prove you were hopelessly provincial. It was also where the French aristocracy, battered by revolutions and drained by taxes, clung to their titles like drowning men to driftwood. For a Vanderbilt or a Gould, this meant opportunity. You wanted your daughter to be a duchess. Paris had one. He might come with debts taller than the Eiffel Tower, but that was hardly the point. The American mothers understood the game perfectly. They arrived in Paris not as tourists, but as generals surveying a battlefield. They rented apartments on the right bank, ordered wardrobes from Rue de la Paix, and secured invitations to the right salons. Their daughters, powdered and polished, became exhibits in this social marketplace. Behind every pearl necklace was a dowry. Behind every dowry was a strategy. And behind every strategy was a mother who knew that while London's aristocrats sniffed at American vulgarity, The French were more pragmatic. For the French nobles, it was a bitter compromise. The old names, Castellane, Rochefoucauld, Gramont, still carried prestige. But the estates that went with them were often crumbling, the roofs leaking, the servants unpaid. France had stripped its aristocracy of political power long ago. What remained was glamour, and glamour could not be maintained without cash. And so the Count married the girl from New York. He might roll his eyes at her accent, her manners, or her father's vulgar millions, but he smiled at the balance sheet. Parisian society itself was a paradox. On one hand, it embraced the spectacle of these marriages. The salons buzzed with gossip. The newspapers splashed caricatures of American brides weighed down with diamonds. On the other, it never quite accepted them. An American duchess might be admitted to the opera box, but whispers followed her. Too brash, too loud, too fond of displaying her money. She was an outsider who had bought her way in, and everyone was determined to remind her of it. Yet still they came. In the last decades of the 19th century, dozens of American heiresses crossed the Atlantic, drawn by Paris's chandeliers and courtyards, and by the promise of turning money into nobility. Some succeeded, dazzling in salons, raising families, securing their place in French history. Others discovered the bargain was more curse than blessing, the title a crown of thorns. And in their stories, Paris revealed its true nature, a city that could make you feel like a goddess on a pedestal, and in the same breath, strip you down to a cautionary tale whispered in the boulevards. Paris was, after all, the city of both dreams and ruin, and for America's richest daughters, it was both at once. By the late 19th century, Americans had mastered a particular export: daughters. Not corn, not steel, not oil, though those built the fortunes, but carefully packaged young women shipped across the Atlantic like diplomatic gifts, ribboned in pearls and armed with dowries the size of national budgets. The British called them dollar princesses. The French, with their usual talent for insult disguised as charm, muttered about les héritières américaines, who seemed to arrive with trunks full of silk and slightly too much confidence. The mechanics were fairly simple. Europe had titles, America had money. Each side needed what the other lacked. It was the Tinder of the Belle Époque, but with stricter etiquette and more disastrous consequences. You couldn't swipe left, but you could faintly insult someone's family tree over oysters at a ball. London had gotten most of the early attention, with American girls feeding into the grand houses of dukes who couldn't pay their heating bills. But Paris was catching on. The French nobility might not have had the same stiff-lipped dignity as their British cousins, but they had something more dangerous: flair. To marry a French aristocrat was to acquire not only a title, but a whole lifestyle of opera boxes, salons, and the possibility of being painted by a fashionable artist who would quietly make you look thinner. Mothers were the true architects. Alva Vanderbilt, Consuelo Isnaga, and others paved the way, showing that if you were willing to endure snubs, gossip, and occasionally catastrophic marriages, you could force open the gilded doors of Europe. Parisian mothers were horrified by the American style. Too aggressive, too obvious. But they underestimated the relentless efficiency of a woman who had survived a Newport summer of competitive entertainment. These women were professionals. They could smell an impoverished marquis from across the Champs-Élysées. Daughters, meanwhile, were expected to smile and glide through it all. Imagine being 19, your corset tight enough to make sneezing a near-death experience, and your mother hissing in your ear, "That's the Comte de something or other. Smile more." No, not like that. Try to look both innocent and dazzling at the same time. And for heaven's sake, don't mention your father's railroad strike. The French nobles, for their part, were pragmatic. They'd lost political power after the Revolution, and more money after every war and tax bill. What remained was the illusion of grandeur: castles with leaking roofs, family portraits with moth holes, a silver service that hadn't been polished since Napoleon. An American dowry meant repairs, new liveries for the servants, and, if one was lucky, a few more horses for the stables. Love rarely entered the conversation. It was all very transactional. A Vanderbilt or a Gould might win a Duc de something and beam proudly, while the noble family quietly calculated how many chandeliers they could relight before the money ran out. It's not unlike modern influencers marrying billionaires. Both sides bring what the other needs, and both spend the honeymoon carefully managing their brand. Of course, the newspapers had a field day. Satirical papers published cartoons of American girls lugging bags of gold up the steps of French palaces, while thin, elegant counts bowed graciously, hand outstretched. Society writers whispered about new money trying to look old. Everyone mocked everyone else, but everyone still came to the weddings. And so the phenomenon took root in Paris. The salons became a kind of stock market, the heiresses displayed like investment portfolios, the nobles circling like brokers. It was absurd, it was ruthless, and it was exactly what both sides wanted. If the marriages were transactions, fashion was the advertising campaign. Paris couture wasn't just about looking nice, it was about strategic warfare, and the man who turned gowns into artillery was Charles Frederick Worth, the Englishman who made Paris the unquestioned capital of fashion. Worth invented haute couture as we know it. He treated dresses like artworks, charging astronomical sums, and insisting that his clients accept his designs, not dictate them. This was radical at the time. Before him, wealthy women bossed around their seamstresses. With Worth, you didn't argue, you surrendered. He was the Steve Jobs of fashion, visionary, infuriating, and convinced that he knew what you needed before you did. For American heiresses, a Worth gown was more than clothing. It was armor. It said, "I may come from a family that still smells faintly of steel mills and tobacco, but tonight, under this velvet and lace, I am every inch a duchess." It's the 1890s equivalent of rocking up to a board meeting in head-to-toe Chanel while your rival is still shopping at the outlet mall. One look, and the point is made. The gowns were heavy, elaborate, and cripplingly expensive. A single evening dress might cost more than a family of 5 earned in a decade. But you weren't supposed to walk comfortably. You were supposed to glide across a ballroom like a chandelier with legs. The more impractical, the better. If you could dance without falling over, you clearly hadn't spent enough. Fashion houses like Worth, and later Doucet or Paquin, became unofficial allies in the marriage market. They knew which mothers were angling for dukes and which were settling for viscounts. A hemline adjusted here, a jewel-toned fabric there, and suddenly your daughter shone just a little brighter than her rival. Couture was chess, played in silk and satin. Salons and opera boxes became runways. At the Opera Garnier, it barely mattered what was happening on stage. The real performance was in the audience. Rows of heiresses lined like jeweled shop windows, gowns glittering under gaslight. A mother could lean over and whisper, "That's the Countess so-and-so in green satin. She married into the Gramonts last year." And then, with a glance at her own daughter, add, "Ours will do better." It's impossible not to compare this to modern social media. Back then, couture gowns were the Instagram filters of the elite. Each season's collection was a must-have. If your gown was last year's shade, you might as well not show up. And just like today, fortunes were wasted chasing trends that would be forgotten in a month. But the stakes were higher than likes and followers. A gown wasn't just a pretty picture. It was a down payment on a future. The right dress, the right soiree, the right fainting incident at the right moment, all could tip the scales toward a noble proposal. It was exhausting, it was ridiculous, and it was deadly serious. For the Paris couturiers, American heiresses were a godsend. They had endless money and endless need to be impressive. They bought entire wardrobes each season, trunks bursting with gowns so elaborate they sometimes had to be shipped in separate carriages. The couturiers laughed all the way to the bank, while the heiresses staggered under trains of velvet long enough to carpet a small chapel. Thus Paris fashion became the secret weapon in the transatlantic marriage wars. Money bought the gowns brought attention, the attention bought the title, and the cycle spun on, under chandeliers, in whispers, and in satin. If the whole arrangement sounds cynical, that's because it was. But behind the contracts and dowries, there were still individual stories. Glittering, disastrous, sometimes both in the same week. Take Anna Gould, daughter of Jay Gould, the American railroad baron whose fortune was so vast it made enemies out of half of Wall Street. Anna was not considered the most beautiful of the heiresses, but she had something far more valuable, a fortune estimated at $15 million, which in today's terms might as well be a small country's GDP. In 1895, she married Count Bonny de Castellane, a man so extravagantly Parisian, he made peacocks look understated. Bonny was charming, dashing, and broke, which, in this social economy, made him irresistible. Their wedding was a full-blown spectacle. Paris society flocked to see it. Newspapers gushed about the union of money and nobility, and Bonny wasted no time spending her fortune on making sure everyone noticed. He commissioned the construction of the Palais Rose, a mansion dripping with pink marble, gold trim, and enough chandeliers to light a railway station. It became a Paris landmark, and also a cautionary tale. Within years, Bonny's debts outpaced Anna's dowry. Their marriage crumbled under the weight of affairs and financial scandals, and eventually Anna divorced him, an act shocking enough to make international headlines. In the end, she kept her money, but not her illusions. Anna wasn't alone. The Vanderbilts, though most famously tied to England, were regular presences in Paris. Consuelo Vanderbilt, married to the Duke of Marlborough, spent significant time in French salons, and her mother Alva treated Parisian couturiers like co-conspirators in her campaign to elevate the family name. Other heiresses, like Mary Goelet, strutted through the Parisian season with gowns straight off Worth's mannequin, their fortunes practically stapled to their sleeves. Each case followed a familiar pattern. An American heiress arrived, was introduced at the right salon, dazzled in a gown costing the price of a townhouse, and within a year, found herself married into a title with more syllables than working chimneys. For every glowing newspaper announcement, though, there was a whisper, "Yes, but the chateau roof leaks," or "He's already kept by a mistress." The irony was delicious. Paris, a city famed for romance, was where some of the most unromantic marriages of the age were arranged. Behind the chandeliers and roses, behind the endless photographs of blushing brides in lace, the real negotiations happened between bankers and mothers. Love was optional. Dowries were mandatory. And yet, for all the cynicism, there was also triumph. For some heiresses, Paris was the stage where they became legends. Their names echoed in gossip columns, their portraits hung in salons, their gowns described in breathless detail by fashion writers. They had bought their way into European nobility, and no amount of side-eye from French dowagers could erase the fact. Paris devoured them, celebrated them, mocked them, and sometimes spat them out again. But for a shining moment, these American women stood at the very center of its glittering stage. If the heiresses brought the money, what did they get in return? A title, certainly. Sometimes a chateau. Occasionally a husband who wasn't entirely insufferable. But more often than not, the price of marrying into Parisian nobility was steep, financially, emotionally, and socially. First, the financial reality check. A dowry might repair a chateau roof, restock the wine cellar, and relight the chandeliers for 1 or 2 seasons. But many of these noblemen were world-class spenders. They could burn through fortunes like kindling. A single season in Paris, balls, gowns, carriages, jewels, could cost tens of thousands. Within a few years, even the richest heiress could find her fortune siphoned into the black hole of aristocratic debt. Then there was the social tax. French aristocrats, for all their desperation, weren't exactly gracious about marrying Americans. Behind the polite bows and dazzling smiles, there lingered an air of superiority. Letters survived describing American brides as vulgar, too eager, or unpolished. The accent was mocked, the manners nitpicked, and every faux pas, whether a handshake given at the wrong moment or a misplaced curtsy, was catalogued in whispers. Worse still, the in-laws. Aristocratic families had centuries of habits and grudges. A new American wife was expected to fit seamlessly into traditions that made no sense to her. Meals scheduled at absurd hours, rules about which chair to use in which salon, endless rituals of visiting relatives no one liked. It was like marrying into a reality show where everyone hates you, but still insists you show up to dinner. And of course, the husbands themselves. Titles did not guarantee charm. Many were seasoned libertines, quite comfortable maintaining mistresses while expecting their wives to smile politely through it all. Affairs were practically woven into the marriage contract. A young heiress raised on notions of romantic love might quickly learn that her husband's idea of affection was sending flowers to his mistress and sending the bill to her father. Modern comparison? It's like marrying into a famous but bankrupt celebrity family. You get the name, the paparazzi, the spotlight, and the constant humiliation of realizing everyone's just using you for your cash. Some endured it with grim dignity. Others broke under the strain. Divorce was scandalous, but as Anna Gould proved, not impossible. Still, the social fallout was immense. A divorced American countess was often treated as damaged goods, snubbed by the very society that had once courted her. At the end of the day, the price of a title was often higher than anyone admitted. For every glittering soirée, there was a cold chateau. For every dazzling gown, a tear shed in private. And for every triumph, there was at least one whispered reminder that money could buy a name, but not respect, and certainly not happiness. If marriage in Paris was a transaction, gossip was the interest rate. And trust me, it compounded daily. Parisian society lived on whispers, satire, and the gleeful destruction of reputations. The French press adored the spectacle of the American heiress invasion. Le Figaro, Le Gaulois, and the satirical Le Rire filled their pages with caricatures of overdressed American girls dragging sacks of money into crumbling palaces. Cartoonists depicted counts bowing so low their empty pockets flapped in the wind, while their brides teetered under diamonds the size of pigeons. And if you thought the British papers could be cruel, the French had a special gift for it. Their wit was sharper, their ridicule more elegant, and they delivered insults with the precision of a fencing foil. One Parisian columnist quipped that the only thing more exhausting than a new American bride was listening to her try to pronounce bonjour correctly. Language itself was part of the scandal. French was the language of diplomacy, of courts, of culture. It was the Instagram blue check of the 19th century. If you couldn't speak French, you weren't verified. Many American girls arrived with tutors and phrasebooks, determined to master it. Some succeeded, others floundered, betrayed by their accents. And the French noticed. Nothing was funnier to Parisian society than an heiress who could buy a duke but couldn't conjugate avoir. The gossip columns also thrived on marital scandals. Anna Gould and Count Bonny de Castellane were practically a soap opera. His mistresses, her dowry, his spending, her tears. It was all serialized like a Victorian version of Keeping Up with the Kardashians. Paris salons replayed every rumor like gossip podcasts, complete with exaggerated retellings. And here's the thing. Scandal wasn't just tolerated. It was entertainment. A whispered affair at the opera could boost ticket sales. A rumor of a financial disaster made salons buzz with anticipation. Paris practically ran on schadenfreude. To be scandalized was to be relevant. To be ignored was far worse. For the American heiresses, this was a nightmare. They had come for respectability, for noble names, for secure places in history. Instead, they often found themselves front-page punchlines. Paris welcomed their money, but mocked their manners. It's like paying for VIP access at a nightclub, only to discover the bouncer is laughing at your shoes. The gossip machine was relentless, but it also cemented the dollar princess phenomenon in the public imagination. These young women weren't just brides. They were celebrities, scrutinized, criticized, immortalized in ink. Their triumphs were exaggerated, their failures broadcast, their accents mocked for decades. And yet, for all the cruelty, some thrived in it. They learned French, sharpened their own wit, and gave as good as they got. Because in Paris, survival wasn't just about money or gowns. It was about mastering the duel of words. And in that arena, speaking French fluently was as valuable as wearing the latest couture. From the outside, Parisian life for these heiresses looked like a dream. From the inside, it was often closer to a drafty nightmare. Marrying into a noble family meant inheriting not just a title, but a lifestyle rooted in centuries of tradition, and not all of it glamorous. First, the homes. Yes, there were palaces with mirrored salons and ballrooms large enough to house small armies. But many French chateaux were less Versailles, more haunted Airbnb. Roofs leaked, staircases creaked, and heating was theoretical at best. An American girl used to marble bathrooms in Newport might find herself bathing in a tin tub in a room the size of a closet, with servants glaring because she used too much hot water. Then there were the in-laws. Aristocratic families were professional critics. They had spent centuries perfecting the art of disapproval, and a new American wife was their favorite target. Too loud, too fashionable, too much jewelry at breakfast. One wrong move, and you were exiled from family dinners, though, frankly, some probably preferred that. Meals themselves could be baffling. The French dined late, spoke in code, and seemed to use twice as many utensils as strictly necessary. Conversation was its own battlefield, and once again, language mattered. If you couldn't contribute a witty remark in flawless French, you might as well stay silent. Imagine trying to impress your husband's ancient aunt while mentally conjugating verbs. Do I say j'ai été ruiné or je suis ruiné? Either way, you were probably right. And then, the husbands. Titles didn't come with training manuals. Many nobles were charming in public and absent in private, vanishing into mistresses' salons while their wives dutifully hosted dinners. Affairs weren't scandals, they were traditions. An American heiress expecting fidelity quickly learned that Paris considered it provincial. Love was nice, but not required. Servants, too, were part of the equation. Running a French household meant managing layers of staff, each with their own loyalties and grudges. But unlike in America, where servants might at least pretend loyalty, French domestics had no such qualms. They gossiped, judged, and occasionally sabotaged your every move, how you spoke to your husband, how much you ate, which dress you wore, was noted and repeated in kitchens across the arrondissement. The loneliness could be crushing. You might be surrounded by chandeliers and gilded mirrors, but the silence in a drafty chateau was louder than any applause at the opera. Letters home reveal young brides confessing they felt like strangers in a museum, admired but unloved, rich but powerless. To modern ears, it sounds like marrying into a reality TV family. On camera, everything sparkles: gowns, jewels, chandeliers. Off camera, the drama is relentless, the relatives impossible, the bathrooms freezing. You get the fame, but you also get the fine print. And yet, some women adapted. They learned French until their accents vanished, mastered the etiquette, cultivated their own salons, and slowly won respect. A few even managed to bend Paris to their will, proving that money could eventually buy not just a title, but influence. But for many, life behind the gilded curtains was less a fairy tale and more a cautionary tale, proof that glitter, without comfort, is just dust with better lighting. If American heiresses thought marriage to a French aristocrat meant candlelit romance and champagne toasts, they quickly discovered that most of their lives revolved around one thing: meals. Endless, elaborate, exhausting meals. French dining was not food, it was theatre. Imagine a Broadway show, but with oysters instead of chorus lines and a maitre d' instead of a director. You didn't simply eat dinner, you performed it, with 20 courses, 3 languages on the menu, and more silverware than you'd know what to do with. For American girls raised on hearty breakfasts of eggs and bacon, Parisian customs were disorienting. Breakfast, practically non-existent. The French idea of a morning meal was coffee and maybe a croissant, which, let's be honest, is delightful for 3 days. And then you start wondering if anyone has heard of oatmeal. Lunch came late, and dinner came so absurdly late that half the heiresses wrote letters home complaining they were nearly fainting by the time the soup arrived. And oh, the soup. It wasn't chicken noodle. It was consommé à la royale, clear broth with floating gold leaf, just in case you didn't already know you were supposed to be impressed. Then came fish with 6 sauces, meats decorated like wedding cakes, and game birds refeathered so they looked alive again, which probably alarmed the girls from Boston who were used to roast turkey at Thanksgiving. Dessert wasn't pie. It was spun sugar cathedrals, towers of eclairs, or moulded ice creams shaped like swans. Eating one felt less like dessert and more like vandalism, and the ritual of refusing food was crucial. An American girl who cleaned her plate risked being seen as greedy. You were supposed to poke at the pheasant, take a polite bite of truffled pâté, and send it back mostly untouched. It's the 19th century equivalent of Instagramming your avocado toast without actually eating it. Then there were the exotics: frog's legs, snails, cheeses that smelled like socks marinated in brandy. French aristocrats considered them delicacies. American brides sometimes wrote home describing them as punishments. One heiress famously whispered to a friend that she'd rather face her husband's mistress than another round of Roquefort. Wine was another adjustment. In America, wine was occasional, polite, maybe reserved for holidays. In France, it was water with a resume. You had champagne to start, red with the meats, white with the fish, dessert wine, after-dinner cognac. By the end of a Parisian banquet, an American heiress might be ready to faint not from her corset, but from sheer intoxication. And let's not forget the timing. Meals stretched on for hours. A dinner could last so long that by the time dessert arrived, the orchestra had played through half its repertoire and the candles were dripping onto the floor. One American girl wrote that after her first Parisian banquet, she crawled into bed not full, but emotionally exhausted. To modern ears, it sounds absurd. But remember, these weren't just dinners. They were negotiations. Who sat where, who commented on which sauce, who declined which dish. All of it was social chess. If you praised the wrong pâté, you might accidentally insult your hostess. If you reached for salt at the wrong moment, you risked being labelled uncouth. It was basically fine dining crossed with bomb defusal. Still, food was one of the few areas where American money could shine. A dowry might restore the family chateau, but it also upgraded the kitchen. Suddenly, drafty estates once serving cabbage soup were hosting elaborate Parisian banquets. And the young bride, even if she hated the taste of escargot, could at least take pride in knowing everyone else was impressed. If food was confusing, manners were downright treacherous. French aristocracy treated etiquette like a second religion, and the American heiresses, bold, chatty, and sometimes too enthusiastic, often walked straight into traps. In America, politeness was straightforward. Shake hands firmly, say please and thank you. Laugh when something's funny. Hug your aunt at Thanksgiving. Done. In Paris, every move was a minefield. Take greetings. Americans were used to handshakes, maybe even hugs. The French preferred the delicate art of cheek kissing, la bise, but only with the right people, in the right order, at the right time of day. Kiss too enthusiastically, and you were vulgar. Offer a handshake, and you were gauche. One American bride apparently horrified her in-laws by hugging her new mother-in-law at the wedding breakfast. You'd have thought she'd committed treason. Showing affection itself was suspicious. Americans were more open with feelings. A smile, a laugh, a touch on the arm. The French aristocracy prized restraint. Feelings were to be implied, never shown. If you looked too happy with your husband, whispers spread that you must be faking it. If you laughed too loudly at dinner, someone muttered, provincial. The heiresses rarely knew the rules. Even conversation was a test. In America, you could make small talk about the weather or your cousin's new horse. In Paris, you were expected to deliver witty, lightly cynical remarks on art, politics, or the opera, all in perfect French. For a girl still tripping over verb conjugations, it was torture. Imagine trying to sound sophisticated about Balzac when you're still working out whether chien is masculine or feminine. And then there were the gloves. French society had more glove rules than most people have socks. White gloves for opera, pale colours for balls, dark for carriage rides, spotless at all times. An heiress caught re-wearing a pair without powdering them. First, risk becoming the punchline of an entire salon. That's the 1890s version of showing up on a red carpet with your price tag still hanging from your dress. The smallest gestures were scrutinized. Did you sit too casually? Did you smile too wide? Did you ask a question instead of making a clever remark? The French aristocracy collected faux pas, the way some people collect stamps, and an American bride provided a lifetime supply. Modern comparison. It's like moving from a Midwestern barbecue to a Michelin-starred tasting menu, and nobody tells you the forks are different for every dish. One wrong move, and you're the girl who buttered her escargot. And yet, some heiresses learned to adapt. They hired tutors to refine their French, studied etiquette manuals like survival guides, and slowly sharpened their wit until they could deliver a biting remark as elegantly as any countess. Others never quite got it, and Paris never let them forget it. In the end, affection, manners, and language all fed the same lesson. Paris demanded performance. To be too American was to be laughed at. To be too French was impossible. The heiresses walked a tightrope, balancing money and manners, affection and restraint, their every move measured against a system designed to keep them just slightly off balance. If the heiresses thought food and manners were baffling, hygiene and daily habits were their breaking point. Paris may have been the capital of fashion and art, but in the 1890s and early 1900s, it was not necessarily the capital of soap. Many American girls had grown up in palatial Newport cottages with multiple marble bathrooms, hot water taps, and modern plumbing that their fathers proudly boasted about in newspaper tours. They crossed the Atlantic expecting Europe to be the same, only to find themselves in drafty chateaux where a bath meant a tin tub, a kettle of hot water, and a maid who looked judgmental about how much you used. The French approach was different. Daily bathing was rare, perfumes plentiful. Perfume wasn't just a finishing touch, it was practically armor. You might not bathe for days, but if you dabbed yourself with Guerlain or Coty, who could complain? American girls, accustomed to morning scrubs, often wrote letters home about how much they missed the freshness of American bathrooms. One heiress quipped that she could tell how long a countess had been wearing her gown by how many layers of perfume it carried. Then there were the bidets. Americans barely knew what they were, and suddenly they appeared in Paris bathrooms like porcelain mysteries. Some heiresses pretended sophistication while secretly asking their maids for instructions. Others avoided them entirely, writing home that they preferred to be ignorant of certain French customs. Cosmetics also revealed cultural gaps. American society was conservative about makeup. A little powder, perhaps, a discreet dab of rouge if you were daring. But in Paris, the rules were slipperier. Ladies were supposed to look effortlessly radiant, which often meant elaborate tricks, pinching cheeks, biting lips, dabbing vinegar under eyes to achieve fashionable watery looks. Too much rouge was scandalous, unless, of course, it was a duchess wearing it, in which case it became chic. American brides found the whole hypocrisy exhausting. Even the rhythm of the day was different. Americans dined early, went to bed at reasonable hours, woke with the sun. In Paris, society started late, ended later, and slept until the morning was half over. An heiress who dared suggest breakfast before 10 risked being looked at like she'd proposed building a railroad through the dining room. Hygiene and habits may sound small, but they became daily reminders that money bought titles, not assimilation. A girl who once bathed in marble tubs now sat shivering in drafty rooms. A duchess in name, but not in comfort. To modern ears, it's like swapping your spa shower for a gym locker room faucet, and being told this is more elegant. So how did they cope? These young women weren't stupid. They may have been naive at first, dazzled by titles and couture, but they quickly developed survival strategies, some quiet, some bold. First, there were the comfort smuggles. Letters home mention American girls requesting jars of peanut butter, tins of familiar biscuits, even recipes from home. A few insisted on hiring American cooks or training French chefs to prepare Yankee dishes. which scandalized in-laws but comforted the bride. Imagine the horror of a Parisian marquis discovering his dinner table serving clam chowder. Then came the linguistic rebellions. Some women leaned into their English, refusing to erase their accents. If the French mocked them, they mocked right back. Others mastered French so thoroughly they began writing in it, showing off wit sharp enough to silence the salons. For a few, the language battle became the one arena where they could assert dominance. Fashion, too, became a weapon of rebellion. Yes, they bought Worth gowns, but they wore them with American boldness, brighter colours, riskier cuts, jewels displayed more lavishly than French subtlety allowed. If Paris sniffed at it, Newport applauded, and the newspapers happily printed descriptions. One heiress declared, "If I must be mocked, let me be mocked in diamonds." Some resisted the marital status quo. While many aristocrats assumed mistresses were a given, a few American brides simply refused. They used their fortunes as leverage, threatening to cut off funds unless their husbands behaved. Others created their own salons, drawing artists, writers, and thinkers into their orbit, carving out independent power bases beyond their husbands' crumbling chateau. And then there were the quiet rebellions. Letters written in English only, little American flags tucked into vanity drawers, private jokes about in-laws scribbled in diaries. They may have played the Duchess in public, but in private, they clung to the identities that Paris tried to strip away. To modern eyes, it's easy to see them as victims, but many of these women were fighters in corsets. They adapted, schemed, and bent rules where they could. They might not always have found happiness, but they carved out survival, sometimes with wit, sometimes with money, often with both. And occasionally, they turned the tables. Paris may have mocked their accents, their manners, their habits, but Paris also depended on their money. When an American duchess decided to play hardball, even the snobbiest French in-law had to listen. After all, chandeliers don't pay for themselves. For every heiress who learned to cope, there were those who simply couldn't. Paris, for all its sparkle, had teeth, and when it bit hard. The most famous cautionary tale was still Anna Gould. She had married Count Bonny de Castellane with the optimism of a girl buying her way into history. What she actually bought was a world-class spendthrift. Bonny treated her fortune as though it were monopoly money. Palaces, jewels, horses, endless parties. Within a decade, her millions had melted like snow in a spring rain. Worse still, his string of mistresses and scandals made her a constant target of gossip. By the time she divorced him, she had enough material humiliation to fill an encyclopedia. Others fared little better. Some American brides married men whose estates were more myth than substance. They found themselves rattling around in half-empty chateaux with no money to heat the rooms and no servants left to polish the silver. One wrote home that her new title was Duchess of Drafts because the wind whistled through the windows of her supposed palace. A few were tricked outright. Aristocrats exaggerated fortunes, hid debts, and wooed mothers with polished charm. Once the marriage contract was signed, the truth emerged. Unpaid mortgages, creditors at the door, estates barely held together. By then, it was too late. Divorce meant scandal. Staying meant misery. Some lost more than money. They lost reputations. Paris society could be brutal, and once it turned against you, recovery was nearly impossible. An American who was mocked in salons or painted in satire magazines as vulgar might find herself socially frozen out. No invitations, no opera boxes, no respect. In a culture where reputation was currency, that was bankruptcy. And of course, there were those who lost love itself. Some of these young women had dreamed, naively perhaps, of marrying not just a title, but a man who adored them. What they often found instead was indifference. Husbands who saw them as bank accounts, marriages that were legal contracts, nothing more. Mistresses flaunted in public, affection rationed out like rare commodities. Letters from the time described the loneliness of these women in excruciating detail. One heiress confided to her sister, "I am surrounded by chandeliers, and yet I live in the dark. The irony is hard to miss. They had left America seeking grandeur and romance, only to find poverty and emptiness dressed up in French lace. It's the 19th century equivalent of buying a luxury handbag and discovering it's a knockoff, but you can't return it, and everyone can see the stitching is coming undone. Not every American heiress lost everything, but enough did that the pattern became clear. Titles could be bought. Respect could not. Happiness, least of all. By 1914, the whole system was cracking. The Belle Epoque, that golden era of chandeliers and champagne, was about to collide with the ugliest war Europe had ever seen. And the marriages between American fortunes and French titles suddenly looked less like triumphs and more like relics. World War I tore apart the very fabric of aristocratic life. Those grand Paris salons went dark. Chateaux became hospitals, or worse, targets. Titles meant nothing when shells were falling on Picardy. The carefully staged dinners, the sparkling soirees, the elaborate gowns, all seemed grotesque against the backdrop of trenches and gas masks. For American heiresses, the dream unraveled. Some were widowed within months, their noble husbands killed on the front lines. Others found themselves stranded in France, their fortunes drained, their households in chaos, their jewels sold to keep the lights on. The Parisian press, once so eager to mock their accents, now had bigger tragedies to cover. The gossip stopped, but only because the world was too busy grieving. Even before the war, the cracks had shown. The younger generation of Americans had started to roll their eyes at the whole practice. Why buy a title when you could spend your fortune on Fifth Avenue palaces or Newport cottages that made European chateaux look quaint? By the 1910s, Wall Street and Hollywood were the new centers of glamour, and Parisian aristocrats no longer looked like the future. They looked like the past. Language, too, shifted. French remained elegant, but English was becoming the language of business, trade, and eventually diplomacy. The American girls who once struggled to conjugate avoir now had the satisfaction of watching French dukes scramble to learn English. It was a small but delicious reversal. By the 1920s, the age of the dollar princess was over. The salons remembered them with a mix of nostalgia and disdain, like a scandalous old affair you'd rather not discuss but secretly can't forget. Paris, of course, remained Paris. Dazzling, cruel, irresistible. But the idea that an American fortune could buy a European fairy tale had been exposed as exactly what it was, a glittering illusion. And yet the stories endure. We still talk about Anna Gould, about Boni de Castellani, about the Vanderbilts and their Parisian escapades. We remember the gowns, the scandals, the endless dinners, the chandeliers that lit rooms where marriages were made and broken. Because even if the experiment failed, the spectacle was unforgettable. It's tempting to laugh at it now, the way you laugh at a reality show that spiraled out of control. But beneath the absurdity lies something human, the hunger for status, the longing for belonging, the dream of turning money into magic. The heiresses who walked into Parisian salons with trunks of silk and mothers whispering strategies weren't just ridiculous, they were also vulnerable. They wanted the same thing everyone wants, to matter. Paris promised it, and Paris, as usual, delivered, until it didn't. And so, the carriages rolled away from the boulevards, the chandeliers dimmed in the salons, and the last of the American heiresses folded up her Worth gown and wondered whether it had all been worth it. For a glittering moment, Paris had been their stage, a place where fortunes bought titles, and titles promised happiness. But in the end, many discovered that behind the velvet curtains and the endless courses of party, there was little more than draughty chateaux, indifferent husbands, and a gossip machine that never ran out of ink. It is tempting to laugh at them, these young women paraded like investments across candlelit ballrooms. And perhaps we should. But there's also something quietly tragic in their stories, the way they crossed oceans chasing magic, only to find paperwork. They remind us that wealth can buy many things but not affection. Titles can open doors, but not hearts. And that Paris, for all its light, can cast very long shadows. If you enjoyed tonight's story, please tap the like button, subscribe for more gentle journeys into history's glittering illusions, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I always love knowing where these stories are keeping you company. Until next time, may your dreams be chandelier lit, your fortunes intact, and your titles purely honorary. Sleep well. Script written by Clara Finch. Because good stories always deserve a soul.